Do you ever get frustrated generating code using large language models? Maybe you started using ChatGPT and you got some really good classes or files being created just by the way you wrote the prompts. And then you decided to move on to Claude Dev or Cursor and you were able to generate an application really quickly. But what happens when you're working with a big code base and everything that you try to do just doesn't quite work? Having great quality prompts and access to the code is a good starting point for generating code. But if you don't have semantic meaning, then the generator will often get lost. So in this video, we're going to talk about documentation and examples, and we're going to do it by generating a workflow that allows us to generate quick and easy documentation that the large language model will love when it's generating code. There's a term out there called read the manual, and a lot of people struggle with this particular term, which is why it's called RTFM. I'm one of those people. I love to look at code, but I don't necessarily want to figure out how it works from a written format. The way I like to learn stuff is usually through unit tests, because unit tests are a great way of seeing examples of how code works. But a lot of developers don't actually want to write unit tests, and even less want to write documentation that we just talked about. But the thing is, having access to unit tests gives you access to examples of how code works, and having access to documentation gives semantic meaning of how information flows. Maybe it's an entity relationship diagram or a data flow diagram, or maybe just a description of use cases. So in this video, I'm going to use the agent workflow design to come up with a list of GPTs and agents that we could use to help create documentation in a code base, but specifically the sort of documentation that would make sense to a code generation system like Cursor or Claude Dev. Now, I had a quick conversation with ChatGPT, and you're seeing it here, where it's talking about the documentation. Now, this is the documentation you'd want in any coding project. And if you've already had to write code using ChatGPT or a large language model, you're probably putting some of the information that you see here into the prompts. But why put it into the prompts when it probably should be in your documentation? So the things it can talk about is the purpose of the project. You could have a requirements document. We got down here the architectural paradigms you want to use. Is it an n-tiered application? Are you using CQRS? What sort of principles do you want? So it's one thing to say, I want to use solid, I want to be dry, I want single responsibility principle, but there might be other more esoteric patterns and ideas that you want to work with. And you can bake that directly into the documentation, because the documentation can be made available with the code. Hopefully the code generation is going to follow those principles. Next, you might want to talk about the different modules within the application. Now, let's assume you're working with some sort of clean code architecture, but within it you've got, say, a SaaS application and you're using some sort of model view controller going on, or maybe you're using an infrastructure as code setup, which is what I do. I do agent as code, and in that particular case I might want to use design patterns such as the director and the builder pattern. Now, I might have both of those modules in the same code base, and the patterns and the designs that you go with for the code are actually specific to different areas in the code base. It's not a global concept. So you could bake that into your documentation. If you're doing unit tests, this can be a great way of providing examples, but another good way is actually to write an example and to have some actual seed data or sample data that looks really correct. And often I'll use synthetic data generated either using tools like Faker or a large language model designed to create synthetic data. Now we can have these examples that show the usage of code and how they all flow. And from the flow point of view, we could move into entity relationship diagrams. We can have schemas, stuff like that. Now, whenever I take the time to write documentation, I do a lot of library projects. My code generation just becomes a whole lot better, because there's not just the code to rely on, there's also this semantic information. So what I'd like to do is come to the agent workflow architect, and we're going to develop a bunch of steps very much like the ones that we're working through right now, which when used will allow us to generate really good quality documentation that's actually useful for large language models. So the first thing I want to do is clarify the actual objective of this particular workflow. To do that, I'll need some sort of goal and an idea. What I've done is just pre-set up a goal, and the goal is develop tools that assist in structured code-based documentation with human oversight. Focus on patterns, use cases, components, and system architecture. I'm just going to paste that information in here. And I've also, from the conversation I was already having, developed the basic idea that I want to work with. This is going to be the basis of knowledge for the workflow we're creating. We'll run the particular prompt. What it's come up with is an objective. The workflow aims to coordinate multiple GPT agents in the development of tools that assist in the analysis, structuring, and documentation of complex code bases. And there's a fair bit of extra information going on. I'm just going to copy this information and figure out what sort of steps might be involved. So we'll put the information in here and come back to ChatGPT, and we'll just run that particular prompt. Now the list of steps have come up, and we've got here define a project scope and objectives. We've got things like identify patterns and use cases. We've got testing patterns, and this is a relatively good list. We could refine it if we want, but at the moment we'll copy the code, head back to the workflow design, and we'll just move on to the next idea, which is to organize these steps into some sort of category. And we'll copy the information and paste it in. Now we have an organized list of steps. When I look through it, I don't like that it's saying phase 1, 2, 3. We'll get rid of that. This last one, the review and refinement, which is about human oversight. Well, the way I do GPT is that's kind of implied. It's not needed as an actual task. But what might be useful is a list of tools to generate certain types of documentation, such as a use case or a table schedule. What I'll do is I'll just make a little modification here to remove those phases. We'll rename the last one, and we'll just get it to list 5 to 10. So we now have a hierarchy, and this is basically representing 16 different GPT agents across 4 different categories. Now that we know what the workflow is going to do, let's come up with a nice name for it. We'll come up with 5 potentials, and the actual workflow you're looking at right now is named Agent Workflow Architect, and that was come up using this process. Now we have 5 useful names we can work with: the architecture document collaborator, we've got the code insight framework, but the one I think I'm going to go with is .flow AI. Now the last step in the agent workflow design is just bringing it all together. We've got a table of the different phases. We've got a step name for each task. There's about 16 here. We've got the descriptions, and it's come up with some input attributes that might make sense for each agent and potential output attributes, and sometimes the output attributes will become inputs for other tasks. So with the .flow AI assistant specification created, what I'd like to do now is turn it into a visual interface so that I can run it and start creating documentation. Now, the way I do that is I create a domain specific language with all the information that we're being collecting. This will then turn into a visual tool. We'll just take the information that we got here, head over to GPT, and we'll paste it in. And what we're going to start seeing is a domain-specific language being written. It'll be called the .flow AI assistant. There's a description of what it does. There'll be a location for the prompts to go into. There'll be a default large language model like GPT-4o. There'll be a bunch of attributes that are going to be collected, and they can be used in various prompts along the way. After that, it's just a bunch of sections and steps. Now I'm just going to take all the information that we've got over here, press copy, and paste it. Then when I press head over to a web view, we should now have the .flow AI assistant with firstly on the annotation and planning of documentation for a project, define the scope, analyze the code base. You can go from step to step, and there's parameters that can be filled in. There would be prompts that I need to write. And once that's all done though, we can start generating new documentation for an application. The reason I decided to create this workflow today was I was in the middle of doing a video on Claude Dev, and in particular I was using Claude Dev to modify Comfy UI. One of the things I'm trying to do is hook my agent as code system up to this particular user interface because it's got similar sorts of concepts, only it's a lot more fluid. So we've just gone over 16 different agents and 4 different workflows that we designed fairly quickly for documenting a software development project. In the next video, what I want to do is use this documentation tool once I've written the prompts so that we can document the agent as architecture software package. And this is all part of a video I'm doing on using Claude Dev to generate code. So Check it out in the next video. I'm Abby Dave. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you soon.